Alexander Wellington III had never heard the word no spoken with any real authority in his 18 years of life. Born into one of the wealthiest families in the country, he lived in a world where money solved every problem and connections opened every door. His father owned half the city's real estate, and his mother sat on the boards of 3 major charities. The Wellington name carried weight that most people could only dream of. On this particular Tuesday morning, Alexander woke up in his penthouse bedroom overlooking the capital city. The room was bigger than most people's entire apartments, filled with the latest technology and designer furniture that cost more than an average person's yearly salary. His personal assistant had already laid out his clothes for the day, a custom-tailored suit that cost enough to feed a family for months. Alexander had one goal today: to attend the exclusive Royal Academy ceremony where the Crown Prince would be presenting awards to outstanding students. The problem was he hadn't actually been invited. His grades were mediocre at best, and his behavior at his private school had been questionable. But in Alexander's mind, these were just minor details that money and influence could easily fix. As he drove his brand-new sports car through the city streets, Alexander felt the familiar rush of power that came with his lifestyle. People stared at the expensive vehicle, stepping aside as he parked wherever he pleased. Traffic rules seemed optional when you could afford any fine. Parking restrictions didn't apply when your father donated millions to the city council's pet projects. The Royal Academy stood like a fortress in the heart of the city, its ancient stones telling stories of centuries past. Today it was surrounded by an unusual level of security. Royal guards in their distinctive red uniforms stood at every entrance, their faces serious and alert. These weren't ordinary security guards. They were elite soldiers trained to protect the royal family with their lives. Alexander pulled up to the main gate in his flashy car, music blasting from the premium sound system. He rolled down his window and flashed his most charming smile at the guard who approached. The guard was a tall, stern-looking man in his 30s with sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. "Good morning, sir," the guard said politely but firmly. "Do you have an invitation to today's ceremony?" Alexander laughed, the sound echoing off the Academy's stone walls. "An invitation? Do you know who I am? I'm Alexander Wellington III. My family practically built half this city." He gestured dismissively at the guard as if the man's question was ridiculous. The guard's expression didn't change. "I understand, sir, but I still need to see your invitation. Security protocols are very strict today due to the Crown Prince's presence." This response caught Alexander off guard. He was used to people immediately recognizing his name and bending over backward to accommodate him. Shop owners gave him discounts without being asked. Restaurant managers always found him the best table, even without reservations. Police officers who pulled him over for speeding often let him go with just a warning after hearing his last name. "Listen, here," Alexander said, his voice taking on an edge of irritation. "I don't think you understand the situation. My father donates more money to this institution in a year than you probably make in a decade. I don't need some piece of paper to attend a ceremony at a school my family supports." The guard remained perfectly calm and professional. "Sir, I appreciate your family's contributions to the Academy, but today's event is by invitation only. The Crown Prince's security detail has given us very specific instructions. No one enters without proper credentials." Alexander felt his face growing red with anger. This was not how things were supposed to work in his world. When he wanted something, he got it. When he demanded entry somewhere, doors opened. The idea that some ordinary guard would dare to refuse him seemed impossible. He stepped out of his car, leaving the engine running and the door wide open. His expensive shoes clicked against the cobblestones as he approached the guard. "Maybe you didn't hear me clearly. I am a Wellington. We don't get turned away from anywhere in this city. I suggest you call your supervisor and explain that you're about to make a very costly mistake." Other guards at nearby posts began to take notice of the commotion. Several of them moved closer, their hands resting casually but meaningfully on their weapons. These men had faced down actual threats to the royal family. An angry teenager from a wealthy family was hardly intimidating to them. The guard Alexander was arguing with spoke into his radio requesting backup. Within moments, a senior officer approached, a decorated veteran with numerous medals on his chest and eyes that had seen real combat. "What seems to be the problem here?" the senior officer asked. Alexander turned to him with relief, assuming this older, more experienced man would surely recognize the importance of the Wellington name. "Finally, someone with authority. This guard of yours is refusing me entry to the ceremony. I'm Alexander Wellington III, and I demand immediate access." The senior officer listened carefully, then looked Alexander up and down with the practiced eye of someone who had dealt with entitled troublemakers before. "Young man, I don't care if you're the Prince of Wales himself. Without an invitation, you don't enter these grounds today. The security of the Crown Prince is not negotiable." Alexander felt his world tilting slightly off its axis. This couldn't be happening. There had to be some mistake. In his experience, there was always a way around obstacles like this. Money, connections, threats, charm, something always worked. He pulled out his phone and began dialing his father's number. "We'll see about this," he muttered angrily. "One phone call, and you'll all be looking for new jobs." The guards watched, with patient amusement as Alexander waited for his father to answer. They had seen this type of behavior before, from privileged young people who had never faced real consequences for their actions. Today, however, would be different. Today, Alexander Wellington III was about to learn that some lines could not be crossed, regardless of wealth or family name. Alexander pressed his phone against his ear, waiting for his father to pick up. Richard Wellington II was in a board meeting discussing a major real estate deal worth hundreds of millions. When his son's call came through, he excused himself and stepped out of the conference room. "Alexander, what is it?" "I'm in the middle of something important." His father's voice crackled through the expensive phone. "Dad, I need you to make some calls right now. I'm at the Royal Academy trying to attend the ceremony, and these guards are refusing me entry. They're being completely unreasonable about some stupid invitation requirement." Richard Wellington sighed heavily on the other end of the line. He had spent years building relationships with government officials, military leaders, and royal advisors. These relationships were delicate and took decades to cultivate. "Alexander, please tell me you're not causing a scene at a royal event." "I'm not causing anything. These guards just don't understand who they're dealing with. Call General Morrison, or that royal advisor you play golf with. Get me inside right now." The senior guard, overhearing parts of the conversation, stepped closer to Alexander. "Sir, I need to inform you that if you continue to refuse to leave the premises, we'll have no choice but to consider you a security threat." Alexander covered his phone and glared at the officer. "A security threat? Are you out of your mind? I'm trying to attend a school ceremony, not launch an invasion." His father's voice became stern through the phone. "Alexander, listen to me very carefully. You need to leave immediately. Do not push this any further. The Royal Security Forces are not people you want to antagonize." But Alexander was too angry and embarrassed to listen to reason. A small crowd had begun to gather at the academy gates. Students, parents, and staff members were watching the confrontation unfold. Some were taking pictures and videos with their phones. The thought of backing down in front of all these witnesses was unbearable to his ego. "Dad, I'm not leaving until I get inside that ceremony. Use your connections and fix this right now." The line went quiet for a moment before his father spoke again, his voice cold and disappointed. "Son, some doors cannot be opened with money or influence. You're about to learn that lesson the hard way." Before Alexander could respond, his father hung up. The young man stared at his phone in disbelief. His father had never refused to help him before. There had always been a phone call, a favor called in, or a check written to solve any problem. The senior guard was speaking quietly into his radio again, and Alexander noticed more security personnel arriving. These weren't regular academy guards. They were royal protection officers in plain clothes, easily identifiable by their alert postures and the way they positioned themselves around the area. "Last warning, sir," the senior guard said firmly. "You need to return to your vehicle and leave the premises immediately." Alexander looked around at the growing crowd of onlookers. Some were pointing and whispering. Others were openly recording the confrontation on their phones. The thought of these videos spreading on social media, showing him being turned away like some common troublemaker, filled him with rage. "I'm not going anywhere," he declared loudly, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "This is discrimination, plain and simple. You're treating me this way because I'm young, but you wouldn't dare refuse entry to my father or any other adult with the Wellington name." The guard's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Sir, this has nothing to do with your age or your family name. These are security protocols established by the Crown Prince's protection detail. They apply to everyone without exception." Alexander decided to try a different approach. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, thick with cash and premium credit cards. "Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. I understand you're just doing your job. How about I make a generous donation to the Guards' benevolent fund? Say £10,000. The offer hung in the air like a bad smell. The guards exchanged glances, and Alexander could see something change in their expressions. What he had mistaken for negotiation was actually the final straw. "Sir," the senior guard said, his voice now ice-cold, "are you attempting to bribe royal security officers in the performance of their duties?" Alexander realized his mistake too late. No, that's not what I meant at all. I was just trying to show appreciation for your service. But the damage was done. Attempting to bribe royal security was a serious offense, far more serious than simply trying to crash a ceremony without an invitation. The guards were now required to treat him as a potential criminal, rather than just an annoying trespasser. 2 additional officers moved in from either side, positioning themselves so Alexander couldn't easily return to his car. "Sir, I'm going to need you to place your hands where we can see them and step away from the vehicle." "What? This is insane. I haven't done anything wrong." Alexander's voice was rising to near panic levels. The situation was spiraling completely out of his control. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and Alexander could see people he recognized from his social circles. The daughter of a prominent judge was standing near the academy steps, filming everything with her phone. A classmate from his private school was shaking his head in apparent disbelief. "Sir, you attempted to bribe royal security officers," the guard explained matter-of-factly. "That's a criminal offense under the Crown Protection Act. We're going to need to detain you pending further investigation." Alexander felt the world closing in around him. This couldn't be happening. There had to be some way out of this nightmare. His mind raced through options: calling his mother, contacting the family lawyer, reaching out to any of the influential people who owed his family favors. But as he looked at the stern faces of the royal guards surrounding him, Alexander began to understand that he had crossed a line from which there might be no return. These men didn't care about his family's wealth or connections. They cared only about their duty to protect the Crown Prince and maintain the security of the royal event. For the first time in his privileged life, Alexander Wellington III was about to face consequences that money couldn't fix. The handcuffs felt cold and foreign around Alexander's wrists. He had seen them in movies and television shows, but feeling the metal against his skin was an entirely different experience. The reality of his situation was beginning to sink in, as the senior guard read him his rights in a clear, professional voice. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say may be given in evidence against you. You have the right to consult a solicitor privately at any time. If you cannot afford a solicitor, one will be provided for you free of charge." Alexander's expensive suit wrinkled as he was guided away from his sports car toward a waiting police van. The crowd of onlookers had grown even larger, with phones and cameras capturing every moment of his humiliation. He could hear whispers and murmurs rippling through the group. "Is that really Alexander Wellington?" someone asked. "Can you believe it? Trying to bribe the royal guards," another voice responded. "His father is going to be furious when he finds out about this." The walk to the police van felt like the longest journey of Alexander's life. Each step took him further away from the world of privilege and immunity he had always known. The cobblestones beneath his expensive shoes seemed to mock him with every click of his heels. As they approached the van, Alexander caught sight of his reflection in the tinted windows. His perfectly styled hair was now disheveled, his face was flushed with embarrassment and anger, and his eyes held a look of panic he had never seen before. This wasn't the confident, entitled young man who had driven up to the academy gates just an hour earlier. "Please," he said to the senior guard, his voice much quieter now. "Can't we work something out? My family has always had excellent relationships with law enforcement. My father plays golf with the chief constable every month." The guard's expression softened slightly, not with sympathy, but with something that might have been pity. "Son, this isn't a parking ticket or a noise complaint. You attempted to bribe officers protecting a member of the royal family during an official state function. The chief constable himself couldn't make this go away even if he wanted to." The rear doors of the police van opened with a metallic clang that seemed to echo off the academy walls. The interior was stark and utilitarian, a far cry from the luxury vehicles Alexander was accustomed to. Hard metal benches replaced leather seats, and the smell of disinfectant filled the air instead of expensive cologne. As Alexander was helped into the van, he saw a familiar face in the crowd. James Morrison, son of the general his father often mentioned, was standing near the academy entrance in his military dress uniform. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Alexander saw something in James's expression that cut deeper than any words could. Disappointment mixed with second-hand embarrassment. The van doors closed with a finality that made Alexander's stomach drop. Through the small reinforced window, he could see the Royal Academy growing smaller as they drove away. The ceremony he had been so desperate to attend was continuing without him, the Crown Prince completely unaware of the drama that had unfolded at the gates. During the short drive to the police station, Alexander tried to process what had happened. How had a simple desire to attend a school ceremony led to this nightmare? He replayed the morning's events in his mind, looking for the moment where everything went wrong. The realization hit him gradually. It wasn't one moment. It was a lifetime of expecting special treatment, of believing that rules didn't apply to him, of never accepting no as a final answer. The guards hadn't treated him unfairly. They had treated him exactly like anyone else who tried to force their way into a secure royal event. The police station was a world away from anywhere Alexander had ever been. The building was old and institutional, with fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows on everyone's faces. The booking desk was staffed by a tired-looking sergeant who had processed hundreds of cases just like this one. Another one who thought money would get him past royal security, the sergeant muttered to his colleague as Alexander was brought in. The booking process was methodical and humiliating. Alexander had to empty his pockets, surrender his expensive watch and jewelry, and pose for mugshot photographs that would become part of his permanent criminal record. His wallet, which had seemed so powerful when he tried to bribe the guards, was now just another item sealed in a plastic evidence bag. "Phone call," the processing officer said, sliding an old-fashioned telephone across the desk. Alexander's hands shook as he dialed his father's number. Richard Wellington answered on the first ring. He had clearly been waiting for this call. "Dad, I'm at the police station. They arrested me for trying to bribe the guards. You need to get the lawyers down here right now and fix this mess." But the silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. When his father finally spoke, his voice was colder than Alexander had ever heard it. "Alexander, do you understand what you've done? You haven't just embarrassed yourself. You've potentially damaged relationships that our family has spent generations building. The royal court, the military leadership, government officials, they all know our name, and now they'll associate it with your behavior today. But Dad, you can fix this, right? Call in some favors, make some donations, whatever it takes." Another long pause. "Son, there are some things that can't be fixed with money or connections. When you attempt to bribe officers protecting the Crown Prince, you cross a line that leads into a completely different world, a world where the Wellington name carries no special weight." Alexander felt panic rising in his chest. "What are you saying? Are you not going to help me? I'll send the family lawyer to represent you, and I'll ensure you have the best legal defense available. But Alexander, you need to understand that this time you're going to face real consequences for your actions. No amount of influence can change that." The call ended, leaving Alexander alone in the institutional bleakness of the police station. For the first time in his life, he was truly on his own, facing a situation that his family's wealth and connections couldn't resolve. As he sat in the holding cell, waiting for his lawyer to arrive, Alexander began to understand that his comfortable world of privilege was about to come crashing down around him. The boy who had never heard no was about to learn what that word really meant. The holding cell was a concrete box barely larger than Alexander's walk-in closet at home. The walls were painted an institutional green that had probably been chosen specifically because it was the most depressing color imaginable. A thin mattress on a metal frame served as the only furniture, and the smell of countless previous occupants lingered in the stale air. Alexander sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing his expensive suit that now felt like a costume from a play he no longer understood. The fabric that had cost more than most people's monthly rent looked ridiculous in this harsh environment. His designer shoes, polished to perfection that morning, were scuffed from the walk across the police station's concrete floors. Through the small reinforced window in the cell door, he could hear the normal operations of the police station continuing, officers discussing cases, phones ringing, the clatter of keyboards as reports were filed. Life was going on as normal for everyone except him. The family lawyer, Margaret Thornfield, arrived 3 hours later. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had handled the Wellington family's legal affairs for over 2 decades. Alexander had met her at family dinners and charity events, where she always seemed relaxed and friendly. Today her expression was all business. "Alexander," she said, settling into the chair across from him in the interview room, "your father has briefed me on what happened. I need you to tell me your version of events, and I need you to be completely honest. No embellishment, no justification, just facts." Alexander recounted the morning's events, and with each detail he shared, Margaret's expression grew more serious. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied him carefully. "Do you understand the gravity of what you're facing?" she asked. "It's just a misunderstanding. I wasn't really trying to bribe anyone, I was just trying to make a donation." Margaret shook her head. "Alexander, attempting to bribe a royal protection officer is a serious criminal offense. The Crown Prosecution Service doesn't take these cases lightly. You're looking at potential prison time, a criminal record that will follow you for the rest of your life, and social consequences that will affect not just you, but your entire family." The word prison hit Alexander like a physical blow. "Prison? But I haven't actually hurt anyone. I just wanted to attend a ceremony." "The law doesn't care about your intentions," Margaret explained patiently. "What matters is your actions. You attempted to gain unauthorized access to a secure royal event, and when refused entry, you offered money to security officers. That's the legal definition of attempted bribery." Over the next several hours, the reality of Alexander's situation became increasingly clear. The media had picked up the story, and it was spreading rapidly across social networks and news websites. Videos of his arrest were being shared thousands of times, with commentary ranging from amused to outraged. The headlines were brutal. "Privileged teen attempts to bribe royal guards." "Wellington heir arrested at palace event." "Money can't buy." Everything. "Rich kids' royal humiliation." Margaret showed him some of the coverage on her tablet. "This isn't going away, Alexander. The story has captured public attention because it represents something people feel strongly about: the idea that wealthy families think they're above the law." Alexander watched a news segment where a commentator was discussing his case. "This young man represents everything that's wrong with inherited privilege. He genuinely believed that his family name and wealth entitled him to special treatment, even when it came to the security of our future king." The anchor nodded gravely. "What's particularly concerning is his apparent lack of understanding about appropriate behavior. Attempting to bribe security officers shows a fundamental disconnect from normal social boundaries." Alexander felt sick watching himself being discussed like a case study in entitlement. These people didn't know him personally, yet they were making judgments about his character and upbringing based on a few minutes of bad decisions. His phone, which had been returned to him for the meeting with his lawyer, buzzed constantly with messages and calls. Former friends were either trying to distance themselves from him or reaching out with morbid curiosity about his situation. His private school had already issued a statement distancing themselves from his behavior. The most painful message came from his younger sister, Emma, who was studying at university abroad. Alex, I can't believe this is happening. The story is all over social media here too. People keep asking me if I'm related to that Wellington kid who tried to bribe the royal guards. I'm so embarrassed I don't want to leave my room. Alexander realized that his actions hadn't just affected him. They were damaging his entire family. His parents, who had spent decades building their reputation and social standing, were now facing questions about their parenting and their values. His sister, who had done nothing wrong, was being judged by association. Margaret returned to the holding cell later that evening with an update. The Crown Prosecution Service has decided to proceed with charges. You'll appear in Magistrates' Court tomorrow morning for your initial hearing. The charges are attempting to bribe a public official and disturbing the peace at a royal event. What does that mean for me? Alexander asked, though he was beginning to understand that the answer wouldn't be good. Best case scenario, you're looking at a significant fine, community service, and a criminal record. Worst case, you could face up to 6 months in prison, especially given the high-profile nature of the case and the public interest in seeing justice done. That night, Alexander lay on the thin mattress staring at the concrete ceiling of his cell. The building was never completely quiet. There were always sounds of other prisoners, officers on duty, and the general hum of institutional life. It was a stark contrast to the silence of his luxury bedroom at home. For the first time in his life, Alexander was forced to confront who he really was without the buffer of his family's wealth and influence. Stripped of his expensive possessions and social connections, he was just another young man who had made a serious mistake and would have to face the consequences. The boy who had never been told no was about to learn that sometimes the word no was absolute and final, regardless of how much money was in your bank account or how many important people your family knew. The magistrate's court was packed with reporters, photographers, and curious members of the public when Alexander arrived for his hearing. The media circus that had formed around his case showed no signs of dying down. If anything, public interest had intensified overnight as more details of his privileged background emerged. Alexander walked through a gauntlet of camera flashes and shouted questions, flanked by Margaret Thornfield and 2 junior lawyers from her firm. He had been advised to say nothing to the media, but every fiber of his being wanted to explain himself, to make people understand that this wasn't who he really was. "Alexander, do you regret trying to bribe the guards?" one reporter shouted. "How does it feel to be the first Wellington to face criminal charges?" called another. "Will your family's political connections help you escape justice?" The questions felt like physical blows. Each one reinforced the narrative that was forming around him, that he was a spoiled rich kid who thought he was above the law. The truth was more complicated, but Alexander was beginning to understand that the truth might not matter in the court of public opinion. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was formal and intimidating. The magistrate, Justice Patricia Caldwell, was known for her no-nonsense approach to criminal cases. She had a reputation for treating all defendants equally, regardless of their background or social status. When Alexander's case was called, he stood before the bench feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. The charges were read aloud: attempting to bribe a public official in the performance of their duties and causing a disturbance at a royal security event. "How do you plead?" Justice Caldwell asked, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. Alexander had spent hours with Margaret discussing this moment. They had considered various strategies but ultimately decided that honesty was the only viable approach. "Guilty, Your Honor," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Many people had expected him to plead not guilty and attempt to use his family's legal resources to fight the charges. His admission of guilt was unexpected, and for some observers the first sign that he might actually understand the seriousness of his situation. Justice Caldwell nodded and made notes before addressing the court. "This case has attracted significant public attention, and I want to make it clear that this court treats all defendants equally under the law. Wealth, family name, and social connections have no bearing on the administration of justice. Free." Prosecutor, a stern middle-aged man named David Richardson, presented the Crown's case efficiently. He described Alexander's behavior at the Royal Academy. his refusal to accept the guard's authority, and his attempt to use money to circumvent security protocols designed to protect the Crown Prince. Your Honor, Richardson said, this case represents a clear example of someone believing that rules don't apply to them because of their privileged position in society. The defendant's actions could have compromised the security of a royal event and undermined the authority of law enforcement. Officers carrying out their duties. When it was Margaret's turn to speak on Alexander's behalf, she painted a picture of a young man who had made a terrible mistake, but was genuinely remorseful. She spoke about his previously clean record, his family's contributions to charity, and his youth and inexperience as mitigating factors. Your Honor, Margaret said, my client stands before this court as a young man who has learned a harsh but necessary lesson about the limits of privilege in our society. He has pleaded guilty because he recognizes his wrongdoing and wants to take responsibility for his actions. But Justice Caldwell had heard such arguments many times before. When she delivered her verdict, her words were measured but firm. Mr. Wellington, your behavior at the Royal Academy represents exactly the kind of entitled attitude that undermines public confidence in our justice system. The fact that you believed you could bribe your way past security officers protecting a member of the royal family shows a profound lack of respect for both the law and our democratic institutions. Alexander felt his legs growing weak as he listened to the judge's words. This was really happening. There would be no last-minute intervention from his father, no phone call from a family friend in high places, no magical solution that made everything go away. However, Justice Caldwell continued, I note that you have pleaded guilty, which shows some acceptance of responsibility. You are young, and this appears to be your first offense. Taking these factors into account, I sentence you to 4 months, in prison suspended for 2 years, 300 hours of community service, and a fine of £50,000. The courtroom erupted in noise as reporters and observers reacted to the sentence. Alexander's knees nearly buckled with relief. He wouldn't be going to prison immediately, but the suspended sentence meant he would face jail time if he committed any other offense in the next 2 years. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy resumed. This time, Margaret had prepared a brief statement for Alexander to read. I want to apologize to the royal guards who were just doing their job, to the Crown Prince whose security I potentially compromised, and to my family who have been embarrassed by my actions. Alexander read from the prepared text, his voice shaking slightly. I understand now that privilege comes with responsibility, and I failed to live up to that responsibility. I intend to use my community service to give back to society and to learn from this experience. The statement was brief and scripted, but the emotion in Alexander's voice was genuine. As he finished reading and walked toward the waiting car, he caught sight of his reflection in a shop window. The young man looking back at him seemed different somehow, older, more serious, marked by his experience in a way that would never fully fade. The boy who had woken up that morning in a jail cell was not the same person who had driven up to the Royal Academy gates 2 days earlier. The process of humbling had begun, but Alexander was only just starting to understand how much more he had to learn. 6 months later, Alexander was unrecognizable from the arrogant young man who had tried to bribe his way into the Royal Academy ceremony. His community service assignment was at a homeless shelter in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods, a place he never would have visited voluntarily in his previous life. Every morning at 7 o'clock, Alexander arrived at St. Margaret's community kitchen wearing simple jeans and a plain t-shirt instead of his designer clothes. His expensive sports car had been sold, with the money donated to charity as part of his efforts to rebuild his reputation. He now took public transport to the shelter, riding buses and trains alongside the very people his family had always looked down upon. The work was hard and humbling. Alexander spent his days serving meals to homeless individuals, cleaning bathrooms that hadn't seen proper maintenance in years, and sorting donated clothing that smelled of other people's lives. His soft hands, which had never done manual labor, became calloused and rough. His perfectly styled hair grew unkempt as he learned that appearance mattered less than action. The shelter's director, Maria Santos, was a tough woman in her 60s, who had worked with the homeless population for over 30 years. She had seen plenty of privileged young people doing court-ordered community service, most of whom approached their assignments with barely concealed disgust and obvious resentment. Alexander had started that way too. During his first week, he complained about the smell, the difficult clients, and the basic working conditions. He made it clear that he felt this punishment was beneath him, and that he was only there because the court had forced him to be. Maria had pulled him aside after a particularly bad day, when Alexander had been rude to an elderly homeless man who couldn't afford to donate anything to the shelter. "Listen here, rich boy," she had said bluntly. "You think you're better than these people because you grew up with money and they didn't. But right now, that homeless man you just disrespected has more dignity in his little finger than you've shown in your entire life." The confrontation had shaken Alexander. Over the following weeks, he began to pay attention to the people he was serving, rather than just going through the motions of his community service. He learned their names, heard their stories, and began to understand how quickly circumstances could change for anyone. There was Robert, a former bank manager who had lost his job during an economic downturn, and then his house when his wife left him. There was Sarah, a veteran who struggled with mental health issues that had cost her both her military career and her relationships with family. There was Tommy, a teenager not much younger than Alexander who had aged out of the foster care system, with nowhere to go. Each person had a story, and none of them had chosen their circumstances. Alexander began to realize that the difference between him and the people he was serving wasn't character or worth. It was simply luck. He had been born into wealth and privilege, while they had faced challenges he couldn't even imagine. The turning point came on a cold Tuesday morning in November. Alexander was serving breakfast when he recognized a familiar face in the line. James Morrison, the general's son he had seen at the Royal Academy on the day of his arrest. But James wasn't there as a volunteer or visitor. He was there for a meal. Alexander's hands shook as he ladled soup into James's bowl. The young man's military uniform was gone, replaced by worn civilian clothes. His face was gaunt and his eyes held the hollow look Alexander had learned to recognize in people who had lost hope. "James?" Alexander said quietly. "What happened?" James looked up, clearly embarrassed to be recognized. "After your arrest made the news, the story came out about my father covering up some financial irregularities in his department. He was forced to resign and the scandal destroyed his reputation. I was discharged from the military academy due to the family connection. We lost everything. The house, the savings, all of it." The irony was overwhelming. Here was someone from Alexander's own social circle, someone whose family had seemed untouchable, now standing in line for free food. The revelation shattered any remaining illusions Alexander had about the permanence of privilege and status. "I'm sorry," Alexander said, meaning it more than he had ever meant an apology in his life. "This is my fault if I hadn't caused that scene." James shook his head. "No, it's not. The corruption was there long before your arrest. Your situation just brought attention to it. In a way, you did the right thing by exposing how these systems really work." After his shift that day, Alexander couldn't stop thinking about James's words. He had spent months feeling sorry for himself, focusing on how his life had been ruined by one moment of stupidity. But maybe there was a larger picture he had been missing. That evening, Alexander did something he hadn't done in months. He called his father. Their relationship had been strained since the arrest, with conversations limited to legal matters and financial arrangements. "Dad," Alexander said when his father answered, "I want to talk to you about something important." Richard Wellington had aged visibly in the months since his son's arrest. The stress of managing the family's damaged reputation while trying to support Alexander through his legal troubles had taken its toll. "What is it, son?" "I've been thinking about what happened, and about what I've learned doing community service. I realize now that our family's wealth and influence weren't just privileges. They were responsibilities that we weren't living up to." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we used our money and connections to make life easier for ourselves, but we never used them to make life better for people who really needed help. We gave to charity for tax breaks and social status, not because we genuinely cared about making a difference. Richard Wellington was quiet for several minutes before responding. "You've changed, Alexander. The way you're talking now, it's different. The person I was before the arrest was someone I don't want to be anymore, Dad. I want to find a way to use whatever privilege I still have to actually help people, not just to make my own life more comfortable." Over the following months, Alexander threw himself into his community service with genuine passion rather than mere obligation. He started tutoring programs for homeless teenagers, organized clothing drives using his family's social connections, and began studying social work at the local university. The media, which had been so eager to tear him down during his arrest and trial, began to take notice of his transformation. But Alexander had learned to be wary of attention, whether positive or negative. He declined most interview requests and kept his charitable work as low profile as possible. 1 year after his arrest, Alexander received an unexpected visitor at the shelter. It was the senior royal guard who had arrested him that day at the academy gates. The man was in civilian clothes, and his expression was curious rather than hostile. "I wanted to see for myself what you'd been doing with your second chance," the guard said simply. Alexander looked around the shelter's main room, where he was helping serve lunch to nearly 100 people who might otherwise go hungry. "I'm trying to figure out how to be a better person," he said honestly. The guard nodded approvingly. "The Crown Prince asked me to check on your progress. He believes that people can change if they're willing to do the work. It appears he was right about you." As the guard left, Alexander reflected on how completely his life had changed. The boy who had once believed that money and connections could solve any problem had learned that the most important things in life, respect, dignity, purpose, and genuine human connection, couldn't be bought at any price. The privileged young man who had tried to bribe his way into a royal ceremony was gone forever. In his place was someone who understood that true privilege came not from what you could take from the world, but from what you could give back to it. Alexander Wellington III had finally learned what no meant, and in doing so he had discovered who he really wanted to be.